Imagine being 16 years old, living in Rome, and having the kind of name that screams old money luxury: John Paul Getty III. This kid was the grandson of J. Paul Getty, the oil tycoon so rich he made Scrooge McDuck look middle class. But while his family's wealth could have set him up for a life of ease, young Paul wasn't exactly playing by the family handbook. He was more into bohemian adventures, hanging out with artists, and stirring up trouble in the Eternal City. It was July 10, 1973, a warm summer evening in Rome's Piazza Farnese. The historic square, usually alive with tourists and locals, became the stage for something far more sinister. As Paul strolled through the streets, likely lost in his carefree teenage world, a van pulled up, and before he could react, he was snatched. Just like that, the grandson of one of the world's richest men vanished into the shadows. The kidnappers, a group of men tied to the infamous Ndrangheta crime syndicate in Calabria, had carefully planned their move. They whisked Paul away to a remote location in southern Italy, holding him captive in a dark, damp cave. Their motive? A cool $17 million ransom, an amount that seemed like pocket change compared to the Getty family fortune. When the ransom demand reached the Getty family, you'd think it would have been a no-brainer to pay up and get Paul back. But oh no, this is where the story takes a turn for the bizarre. Paul's father, John Paul Getty Jr., didn't have access to the family fortune and had to turn to the patriarch, J. Paul Getty Sr., and Getty Sr. he refused. In fact, he reportedly said, "If I pay 1 penny, I'll have 14 kidnapped grandchildren." Cold doesn't even begin to cover it. Hooked already? Smash that subscribe button and stick with Talescape. Meanwhile, Paul's life in captivity was a nightmare. His kidnappers weren't just criminals. They were amateurs when it came to human decency. They kept him tied up in brutal conditions, moving him from one hideout to another to evade the authorities. The days turned into weeks, the weeks into months, and the Getty family remained suspicious that the whole thing might be an elaborate stunt by Paul himself. Back in Rome, the media was buzzing with speculation, and the police were scrambling for leads. The Getty name was on everyone's lips, but the family's reluctance to act cast a dark shadow over the entire ordeal. As time dragged on, the kidnappers grew frustrated. They needed that ransom money, and Paul was quickly becoming more of a liability than a payday. Months had passed since John Paul Getty III had been snatched off the streets of Rome. For his captors, patience was wearing thin. They weren't just holding the teenager hostage. They were also holding on to the belief that the Getty family would eventually cave and pay up. But instead of ransom money, all they had was silence from a family that seemed more interested in preserving their fortune than rescuing their grandson. By November 1973, the kidnappers decided it was time to send a message, one that no one could ignore. In an act that was as gruesome as it was calculated, they cut off Paul's right ear and sent it to the offices of an Italian newspaper. Along with the severed ear came a chilling note. "This is Paul's first ear. If within 10 days the family still believes this is a joke mounted by him, then the other ear will arrive. In other words, he will arrive in little bits." The Getty family couldn't ignore this horrifying development, and neither could the public. The image of a 16-year-old boy being mutilated at the hands of desperate criminals shocked the world. But what made headlines even more was J. Paul Getty Sr.'s continued reluctance to pay the full ransom. It wasn't until the kidnappers reduced their demand to $3 million that he budged. Even then, only agreed to pay $2.2 million, the maximum amount he could claim as a tax deduction. The remaining $800,000, he lent it to his son, Paul's father, at 4% interest. Back in captivity, Paul was barely holding on. The conditions he endured were beyond miserable. He was kept in filthy hideouts, surrounded by captors who treated him like a commodity. His health deteriorated rapidly, and the trauma of losing his ear was a constant reminder of how far things had spiraled out of control. As the ransom deal finally came together, Italian authorities coordinated with the Getty family to ensure Paul's release. On December 15, 1973, 5 agonizing months after he was kidnapped, Paul was let go. His captors dumped him at a gas station in Lauria, Potenza, barely alive but free at last. Paul's first call after his release was to his grandfather, J. Paul Getty Sr. It was a gesture of gratitude, a way of saying thanks despite everything. But Getty Sr.? He refused to come to the phone. For a man who once said, "A penny saved is a penny earned," it seemed that empathy wasn't part of the family inheritance. John Paul Getty III's release should have been the end of the ordeal, but in many ways it was only the beginning. The teenager returned to a world that had been forever changed, not just for him, but for everyone involved. The physical scars were undeniable. His ear permanently gone, his body emaciated, and his health deeply compromised. But the emotional toll ran even deeper. Paul's return to his family wasn't exactly a heartfelt reunion. His father, John Paul Getty Jr., was consumed by guilt, having relied on his notoriously stingy father to save his son. As for J. Paul Getty Sr., he continued to act as though the kidnapping had been little more than a financial inconvenience. When asked about his refusal to pay the ransom in full, he famously quipped, "If you pay the kidnappers, you'll encourage them." Cold, pragmatic, and utterly devoid of warmth, Getty Sr.'s response became yet another chapter in the family's already complicated history. But what about the kidnappers? The Italian authorities didn't let the case rest after Paul's release. They tracked down several suspects tied to the Ndrangheta, including low-level operatives and some of the masterminds behind the abduction. In total, 9 individuals were arrested. However, the trial was a messy affair. Despite the evidence, many of the accused were acquitted due to insufficient proof. As for the ransom money, most of it was never recovered, vanishing into the labyrinth of organized crime. Meanwhile, Paul struggled to reclaim a sense of normalcy. The trauma of being held captive and mutilated left deep psychological wounds. He turned to alcohol and drugs to cope, a path that only led to further tragedy. By the 1980s, his substance abuse caught up with him. In 1981, Paul suffered a devastating stroke caused by a toxic combination of drugs and alcohol, leaving him quadriplegic and partially blind. The once vibrant teenager who had roamed the streets of Rome now faced a lifetime of dependence on others. His story, which had once captured headlines for its sensational twists, became a cautionary tale about the fragility of life, even for those born into immense privilege. In the years that followed, Paul's family continued to grapple with their own demons. His grandfather, J. Paul Getty Sr., passed away in 1976, leaving behind a fortune and a legacy tainted by greed and estrangement. Paul's father, devastated by his son's condition and his own role in the ordeal, dedicated his later years to philanthropy and sobriety, trying to make amends for a life filled with regrets. Paul Getty III's life came to an end in 2011 at the age of 54, after decades of suffering. Yet his story remains a haunting reminder of the human cost of greed, neglect, and misplaced priorities. The Getty name may still evoke wealth and power, but for many, it also carries the weight of a family that failed to protect its own. The kidnapping of John Paul Getty III wasn't just a crime. It was a tragedy that unfolded in slow motion, revealing the cracks in a gilded facade. And while the story has been immortalized in films, books, and documentaries, its lessons are painfully simple. All the money in the world can't buy compassion or undo the damage of its absence. Thanks for tuning in to Talescape. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories where the drama is real, the stakes are high, and the twists just keep coming.